Welcome everyone. We're going to get started for this afternoon session. I got a great lineup this afternoon. So just to orient everyone, I'll be providing I'll be emceeing this afternoon, helping. Scott did a great job this morning, and I'll be walking us through the day this afternoon. First up, I will be introducing myself to moderate our first panel. Obviously, over the last several months, we've had water agencies have had a number of impacts due to the COVID-19 emergency. And so we have a great lineup looking at all the financial impacts and how to build resiliency at a water utility. So great lineup set for this afternoon, and starting with that. And then after that, we'll hear about some of the innovations in regulatory compliance across the state. And then we'll hear about some innovations and approach to financing for utilities. So great lineup for this afternoon. As we head into this final stretch on a Friday afternoon, really appreciate everyone tuning in and participating through this wonderful summit. We've started off looking at all the great work in the state and open data from the Data Consortium, hearing about innovations in ag tech and ag work, which is great to learn from given that agriculture uses a significant amount of water. They've done a lot of innovative work over the past few decades. Additionally, hearing about surface water measurement, environmental data, which is helpful in informing how we approach water use, and also this morning hearing about workforce and the importance that plays in innovation and technology. And then one number of great case studies from yesterday afternoon and this morning across a number of innovators and startups. And I think that it's always great to help those, because water often has a reputation as being a hard industry to bring new technologies into. And so it's always good to hear about case studies where that's successful and how that can help. We've had a great conference so far, and we're going right into our home stretch, so appreciate staying with us. So we're going to start off with our financial resiliency panel. I have a very prestigious, and I'm very honored to be moderating this great panel. So we're going to I'll go through and introduce each of our panelists, and then kind of provide some motivation for what they're all going to speak much more knowledgeably than me about. So first off, we have Alexandra, who's an associate at S&P Global, where she's been a member of the U.S. Public Finance Infrastructure Team since 2015, primarily focusing on the Western United States. We have Professor Mara Allaire, who's an assistant professor at UC Irvine in the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy, with a focus on water economics and policy. We have Professor Ariel Dinar, a distinguished professor of environmental economics and policy at the School of Public Policy at UC Riverside, and who I was actually a past student of, so I'm really pleased to have him on board. And then fourth, we'll have Bjorn Kallerud, who's an economist with RDN, who's an economic and rate consulting for the water industry. And last but not least, we have Audrey Dickinson, who's the director of U.S. Public Finance at Fitch Ratings, looking at the U.S. Public Finance Water and Sewers Group based in Austin, Texas. So we have a great lineup, and the primary motivation is looking at financial resiliency. Heading into COVID, primarily water utilities were looking at planning for short-term type of emergencies and droughts and these kinds of things, and we've in general done a really good job of planning for all of these, but a global pandemic was not on the radar for a lot of water utilities. And the challenge is that in a pandemic, water is one of the most critical services, because you need it to maintain cleanliness and public health. And so we're all reliant on it for 24/7 service, even more so in this current emergency. If we could pause the poll for now. So we'll get to that later. So as we look at all of this, water utilities have seen commercial water use. At Milton McGill, we've seen a 50% drop in the smart meter hourly data for our utility over the course of April, and then it's slowly rebounded back. And so, significant drops, changes in water usage, and it's been a combination of the types of issues we've seen between like longer term droughts that are slower moving and more immediate emergencies where you need to respond immediately. And so it's been a unique experience and a lot of learning from that. And I think that we have a great lineup to talk about some of the impacts and how to build resiliency into our finances, and also how to think about this as a shock, and what we can learn from it to better prepare for the future. So I'm going to first have Alexandra talk about some of these issues from S&P Global. So I'll turn it over to Alexandra. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And can you hear my audio? Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today to speak on this financial resiliency panel. As Drew mentioned, my name is Alexandra Asghani, and today we will be discussing how at S&P Global Ratings we have been analyzing the credit quality and financial resiliency of our water utilities during this COVID-19 pandemic and into the future. So I think we have slides available if we can open those up. Great, thank you. And we can move on to the next slide. All right, great. So this is the strengthening cash position of water and sewer utilities. When analyzing our water entity's liquidity position, we look at a combination of both available reserves, but also our days cash to come up with our final liquidity score. Now, as you can see from the first graph, since after the Great Recession, utilities have built up their days cash position, putting them in a pretty good spot to deal with financial pressures related to the COVID-19 pandemic. As many of you are aware, there have been a moratorium on shutoffs, and the average utilities, as you can see, are well positioned with respect to liquidity in the short term to deal with delayed payments and higher delinquencies. Now from the graph here, you can see in 2019, about 90% of our California entities had greater than 150 days cash on hand, with a median of about 550 days. We performed financial triaging of credits that were at risk due to COVID-19, and we analyzed utilities with below 60 days cash. So as you can see, the majority of California entities are well above that. Now the bottom graph here also shows the strength of California utilities in regards to their legally available reserves. And this is a graph with California versus a nation. You can see California is in the darker gray color. And overall, as mentioned though, our overall liquidity score is a combination of both days cash and available reserves. We can move on to the next slide. So here we have strong management teams are key to financial resiliency. Of course, there are many factors that management can't always control, such as a global pandemic, weather, climate, hydrology, regulations, macroeconomic trends, and changes in metered accounts. However, there are many things that a strong financial management team can control. We are seeing strong management teams provide us with COVID-19 stress testing on potential financial impacts, in addition to reasonable financial assumptions and real-time consumption data, in addition to updates to their long-range capital planning and delinquency analysis. So as you can see from the table on the right, which is also a graph of California versus the nation, we have what's called our financial management assessment. And that's 10% of our overall financial profile score. And you can see that, yes, there are two goods there. We do have a range of good, and on the higher end of that score are utilities with more codified investment, debt, and liquidity policies, in addition to long-range financial planning. But one thing to note is that having a strong financial management assessment compares very favorably to also having strong all-in coverage metrics at above 1.6 times, and also having strong available reserves. As we mentioned, one of our higher scores is above 150 days. Now we can move on to the next slide. All right, so what are utilities doing to mitigate some of this financial risk in relation to the current COVID-19 pandemic? So we're seeing utilities defer some non-essential capital spending in the short term. However, in order to do so, it's very important that during the past few years, utility managers have kept up with maintenance and there's not materially deferred maintenance that would cause issues if they deferred. In addition, we're seeing utilities shift to debt financing as well as refinancing some outstanding debt at much lower costs in order to increase overall cash flow. And then another thing we're seeing utilities do is maybe temporarily freeze hiring or keep some vacant positions open. Now, in our opinion, California utilities are actually somewhat insulated in that their rates are set through Prop 218 process. And any revenues derived from these rates cannot be used to transfer out to the general fund if they are under distress. We would consider a general rise in transfers out or a stripping of utilities' cash to be a credit negative. However, if utilities haven't gone through the Proposition 218 process yet, and they plan to later this year or next year, we may expect more pressure in regards to customers not wanting to approve a higher rate increase, or maybe utilities wanting to hold back on next year's rates. Now, in regards to the CARES Act, utilities are probably the least directly impacted by the CARES Act, but indirectly, we believe that they positively affected the underlying economy. Now we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, performing in the face of adverse conditions. We have here a difference between COVID-19 and the drought, and this is a little funky here, but overall, utilities are used to volatility as it relates to hydrology and consumption patterns, conservation and drought. Overall, we have seen the majority of areas that a drought can even have a greater impact than that of COVID-19. What we're seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic is a shift from commercial usage to residential usage, declines in consumption in regards to concentration in areas that are highly industrial or commercial, in addition to some heightened social risk and affordability pressures. Now, what we're seeing in regards to rate structure is over the years, we've been seeing utility managers take a look at their overall rate structure. Whereas maybe in the past, they had about 30% on the fixed component and 70% on the volumetric component, we're seeing them take a look at that and maybe increase that fixed component to provide for more financial resiliency and stability throughout the year and into the future. Now, as S&P Global, as a credit rating agency, we don't have a view of which rate structure is better than the other. However, we do view that in some situations, having a higher percent of a fixed component does provide for more stability throughout the year. Now moving on to our next slide and last slide. All right, so now we have selected inflation rates since 2000, and the colors changed a little bit, but as mentioned earlier, some of our key focuses in regards to financial resiliency due to COVID-19 and in the future, we looked at available reserves, strong financial management, long-term capital planning, and strong coverage metrics. However, something that we will be focusing on very much so in the near term is the overall affordability of your utility system rates. As you can see from this graph here, and the colors change, but the dark blue, the top one is water and sewer rates. They have been increasing at a faster pace than that of inflation. And so overall, and the American Water Works Association did a quick member survey back in April that showed pre-COVID-19 delinquencies were 0.6%, and they expect them to go up to about 6%. So during COVID-19 pandemic, higher unemployment, pressures with poverty rate, the overall affordability of your system rates to the customer base will continue to be a focus in our credit rating analysis. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alexandra, and that really helps provide a lot of good context as utilities come into this current crisis and where we were coming into it, and how we've been able to do such a great job with our strong finances going into this. And so and I saw we got some questions from the audience. We'll wait till the end of this, but keep them coming in. We'll like to get that. And if we don't, we're not able to with time to get to them today, I'll make sure that we circulate those, taking notes, and we'll get back to the audience after. So our next speakers, Mara professor at UC Irvine, and she actually is doing exactly a really interesting look at this exact question of rate structure. So I'm going to turn it over to her to share us some of her interesting results on this. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So yes, I'm Maura Lair, a water economist at UC Irvine, and I would like to touch on not only financial resiliency in the face of COVID, but also implications for water conservation, given that we still need to cope with water scarcity and water districts are tasked with meeting the 20 by 2020 goals. So I'll ask the slides to be pulled up for this session, and yes, we can kick off here. And so water districts face considerable uncertainty, and we need to cope with more extreme drought events, as well as planning for future infrastructure investments. Droughts, as we all know, can wreak havoc on revenue streams as usage drops, and water districts really need to walk a fine line between securing revenues and ensuring that customers are rewarded with lower bills for doing their part to conserve water. Now we're all faced with COVID-19. This presents a challenge, as Alexandria hit on, in terms of customer classes, usage shifting across customer classes, and some specific types of water use also dramatically changing. We'll hear much more about that from the next speaker through Professor Ariel Dinar's presentation. But also infrastructure investments in terms of planning for the future. Water districts must ensure that water sources and distribution and treatment infrastructure can meet future needs. And the question here is that, are revenue and conservation goals necessarily at odds? In many cases, this might be a false trade-off. For example, drought events. Conservation could prevent a water district from tapping into particularly costly sources of water or future infrastructure. Again, conservation could provide a way to reduce costs, either by delaying or downsizing future capacity expansions. And certain water rate structures might allow water districts to achieve both revenue stability as well as conservation. For example, water budget rates could achieve predictable revenue streams while sending a conservation signal to customers. And next slide, please. And so water rates that achieve dual goals of conservation and revenue resiliency have really taken off across the state. In a recent study, my co-author Ariel Dinar and I have looked at how and why pro-conservation water rates are spreading across water districts in California. We're really looking at what motivates utilities to make the switch and what can help or hinder this transition. And to do this, we've actually applied ideas from the technology adoption field. And this is the idea that diffusion of innovations follows an S-curve, like we see on this graph. And perhaps at the very beginning, only a few early adopters use a particular technology, but then it takes off until reaching a point of saturation where only the laggards continue to adopt a certain technology. And so we're asking, in the water sector, what might drive the transition to rates that encourage conservation? And we propose that it's a mix of both shocks and features of the utility. So in terms of shocks, this can include the many unknowns that a utility faces: disasters, climate change, as well as major changes in policy. And utility features could be broken down into two major categories. The first is capacity. Utilities need to have some sort of technical, managerial, and financial capacity in order to make the transition between rate structures. This is what economists would call a necessary transition. It has to exist for a major transition to occur, but it alone is not enough to push utilities over the edge. In addition to these capacity factors, we also need some motivating factors. These are sufficient conditions that can really cause a change to happen. So perhaps there's a desire for greater revenue stability, or perhaps utilities have a really heavy reliance on imports that they want to reduce a little bit through conservation-based rates. And I'll also clarify what we mean about pro-conservation. We're really looking at tiered rates. So either increasing block rates or water budget rates. Both of these really send a price signal to customers to conserve, because the price per volume jumps up on customers as they use more water. And budget rates, as you know, this is actually a tiered rate that tailors the tier of usage to each individual customer. And it can also guarantee quite a bit of revenue stability for utilities, since customers, as long as they stay within their reasonable allotted use, really don't tend to jump across tiers all that much. So tiered rates have been gaining in popularity across California, and I'd like to do an audience question, if we can pull up the poll. And I'd like the audience to guess how many utilities right now in California have tiered rates. Tiered rates being either increasing block rates or water budget rates. Take your best guess, and this is anonymous, I believe, and we're gonna share our answers in just a bit, but this is to take the temperature of the room right here and now. All right, maybe we'll wrap up voting in the next 5 seconds. And if we can display the results, it'd be great to know what everyone's thinking. So we have a wide range of opinions. Majority believe, right, it's close to being 63%. We sort of have guesses across the board. Well, it turns out, surprisingly, that the answer is it's over 71% at this point of California water utilities that have jumped on the tiered rates bandwagon. So that's extraordinary, and this change has occurred most rapidly over the most recent decade. And so I'd like to share with you, if we can go to the next slide, about this dramatic transition that we've seen in California water rates. If we could advance to the next slide, we can all see a graph that shows us this really dramatic transition. And so this shows, where on this technology adoption curve might we currently be. To do this, we assembled an extensive data set of 585 utilities in California over the past 25 years. Data were combined between the water rate surveys of AWWA, Black and Viatech, as well as data from the state water boards, and my own survey of investor-owned utilities, as well as smaller utilities. And so this is showing the portion of water districts that have pro-conservation water rates. That is shown in the dark black line. And we see really two major waves of adoption if we focus on that solid black line. The first wave was in the early 1990s, where we start off with fewer than 1 in 4 utilities having pro-conservation rates, but this jumps up to about 35% of utilities having pro-conservation rates by the mid-90s. And then we go through a bit of a plateau of stagnation before we see the second major wave in the mid-2000s, and this is when pro-conservation water rates became even more popular than uniform rates. So we have a crossing in terms of popularity in type of water rate structure. And now today, we have over 70% of utilities having this tiered rate structure. Several shocks occurred during this time: droughts, major policy changes, and all of these provided motivation for that transition. And if we can go to the next slide, we can begin to discuss some of the major factors that really drove this transition. There's capacity factors that we briefly mentioned before. We modeled these transitions using a binary choice model, and the factors we were really interested in, we proxied for capacity by size. Service population was a proxy for technical, managerial, and financial capacity. We also considered the portion of connections that were metered. This is a prerequisite for having any sort of volumetric rate structure. And we're also mindful to look at motivators like reliance on imports, and also looking at differences between investor-owned utilities and public utilities, as well as seeing how vocal customers were in terms of the number of service complaints that were received by your utility. And in terms of shocks, really focusing on the drought event that occurred at the beginning of our study period. And if we could advance to the next part of this slide, what we find by cranking through this analysis is that really all of these factors played a role in this great transition to tiered water rate structures. In the case of investor-owned utilities, it appears that they were a bit lagging in terms of that first wave of adoption. It was really only after there was decoupling for investor-owned utilities in the state that they jumped on the bandwagon during that second wave. And if we can go to the next slide, oh, we might need one more click. Grand conclusions that come out of this are that we see this dramatic transition. We also see an incredible variety of factors that aided in this transition. And where might we be going in the future? Well, it seems that perhaps budget rates might be on the verge of a major wave of adoption, at least some people feel, because this provides water districts with an opportunity to achieve both stable revenue streams as well as achieve conservation goals. Yet, a barrier to these particular types of rate structures is the cost of implementation, since the water rate structure essentially needs to be tailored to each individual customers. And last but not least, there might be a role for decoupling to play. To further encourage pro-conservation rates, the state might expand revenue decoupling to publicly owned utilities. This is already available for investor-owned, and this really allowed them to make the shift to tiered rates after 2000, when a statewide decoupling policy went into place. Decoupling is already widely implemented in the electricity and natural gas sectors. In addition to decoupling, maybe rate stabilization mechanisms could play a role by reducing financial risk due to demand swings. And this could especially allow water districts to not only grapple with drought risk, but also unexpected risks, such as the COVID-19 we're currently grappling with now. So with that, I'll close out. Thanks so much for listening and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Mara. And I know it's been a huge tool for our district going into this current crisis, and having the budget-based rate structure and that proactive action taken by our board of directors to put us in that kind of a position to have resilient finances. So it's interesting to see the broader trends. Our next speaker is Professor Ariel Donar, who's going to talk about how to think about this current crisis and shock in comparison to some of the other big shocks that we've seen, like the last recession. So with that, Ariel, take it away. Sorry, you're muted. You just got to unmute yourself.
You are correct. I want just to say a couple of words about how much I enjoyed that conference. I was a little bit skeptical, but the more I was into it, the more I saw how useful it is and how many ideas can come out of it. And I want just to challenge the organizers, or mainly the California Data Collaborative Group. And today I listened to several very interesting presentations by Veruna, Zip, Utility, Rentio, and Synergy, for example. talking about great ideas of data collection, what I missed and what I think is or should be done now is to find or to connect between these data and some of the possibility to make policies that are based on such data. And this is just to talk about, my personal experience and satisfaction from today's and yesterday's sessions. Because Alexandra already talked about some of the ideas that I wanted to bring up, I will be very light on these slides that I had. So departing from what Maura has presented to us, the main idea is that there are several aspects that affect decisions of utilities. And one of these are the shocks that the utilities either are facing or expect to face in the future. And as such, if we want to review what are the shocks that water utilities in California face, next slide, please. So, three types of shocks, that some of which are still with us. So the financial crisis and slowdown, then the prolonged severe droughts, recurring droughts, and then the new kid on the block, the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of these are still, interacting. So there are three types of shocks, but there is only one impact. Next slide, please. And I try to provide a schematic, visualization of these three shocks and how and who is being affected. So we have the climate change induced droughts. We have the financial slowdown that took place starting in 2008, 2009. And then we have the COVID-19 that is in the middle of its impact. All of these affect our customers by reducing their water use, first of all. Second, their ability to pay the bills, even for a reduced water usage. And through the customers, it goes back to the water utilities because they have lower revenues, uncertainty regarding financial sustainability. And the question is, how can we learn from all these three shocks and what has been done in different parts of the world in order to, including data collection, in order to develop better policies or strategies for the utilities that face this kind of shocks. Next slide, please. So data does exist, and even if it is relatively young data set, there is a study that I was able to find. And again, I'm not talking here about any study, past study that I was involved in. I'm just talking about how data can be used in the future or in the present in order to come up with better policies. So this study is a study that was done by a group of researchers, including the consulting company Raftelis, and they collected data from 5 main urban centers in California: Trabuco in Arizona, Marnara and Columbus in Georgia, Denver in Colorado, and Raleigh in North Carolina. They started to collect data on water usage and payments, and they estimated payments or revenues by the bills, not by the actual payments. So this is a little bit incomplete, but still the findings are very interesting, and the findings suggest that the reduction in water consumption can be seen is differential between the residential users and between the other users, and mainly the industrial and non-residential users that are much more affected by the recent COVID-19 pandemic effects. But still, all the estimates are lower than what was expected. And this is an interesting observation. One important control that we must include and talk about is that all these 5 urban centers that are included in the study have implemented a tiered rate water pricing before the pandemic initiated. So we can see some of the impacts on the consumption and on the revenues or the bills that were sent to the users. So this is, in my opinion, an idea for work that can help us understand how utilities can use data in order to come up with better policies or strategies for fighting against the outcomes of that pandemic. Next slide, please. So there I was able to identify also several studies that each listed different actions taken by utilities or by the governments in order to protect the users and in order to protect the utilities. They are taken from all over the world. The point that I want to make in this presentation and in the discussion to come after is that we don't know yet how effective is each of these steps. But with that data that we can collect, and if we can collaborate, in data collection on, sample or the entire set of water utilities in our region, we probably will be able to come up with some comparisons on what works better, what doesn't work, and where. So most of what I am talking to in that slide has been already discussed by Alexandra, so I won't be dwelling into it too much, but if we move more to the next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, no, go back. So yeah, so this is another study that reviewed in Central America utilities and their strategies how to cope with COVID-19 effects of reduced water use and non-compliance with payments of bills. And what we can see here is that there were also governmental and non-governmental institutions that stepped in to provide, especially to the low-income families, to provide alternative sources of water. And this is something that we probably won't see here in California, but this I found is something of interest in general. So next slide, please. And there are 2 slides. These are my last 2 slides by the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, from June 2020 on the expected impact of COVID-19 on water and sanitation sector in the world. And earlier this morning, we talked about the need for a global data set, and somebody that I don't remember his or his name suggested that if we could have a global data set on performance of utilities, it would be very useful. And there is such a data set, and at present I don't have exactly the name, and it is managed by the World Bank. And that data set allows this kind of analysis that is summarized in this slide. So globally, what was found is that, large industrial users are facing the highest decline. There is a concern that if this takes too long, if this lasts too long, then the culture of payments of customers will remain as is and will not return to the normal behavior that is expected from customers. So I think that with that, I'm going to stop. There is, at the end, there is a list that I'm not going to go over, list of references that if you are interested into, in looking into more resources, you can find it there. These are the references of these studies, recent studies. Most of them are from 2020. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any inspiring discussion.
Perfect, thanks so much. So I'm gonna turn it over to Bjorn to show some tools and analytics that can help answer some of these issues that have been posed in terms of looking at shocks, changes in rate structure, and I'm really excited to see some of the really cool analytics that RDN has developed to help agencies look at planning for these types of shocks and changes to rate structure. So with that, Bjorn, you're up.
Thanks, Drew. So my name is Bjorn. I'm an economist with RDN. We're a rate consultant, and I'm here to talk about affordability in the rate setting, from a rate setting perspective, and kind of some new ways that we've been trying to think about this problem and approach a problem. So if we could pull up those slides, please. And I have a poll question here. I was wondering if it's possible to load that up now. So to start this off, we have a poll question here for you all. The total investment required for buried water infrastructure over the next 25 years is approximately $1 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion, or $1 trillion. So we'll give you guys a few seconds here to answer. And then we can take a look at those results. All right, so you guys did better than me on this one, but you guys did great. It's $1 trillion. So next slide, please. So $1 trillion is obviously a lot of money, and that's going to be having to come from rates. This presents a little bit of a challenge as water and sewer costs have outpaced general CPI and other utilities in recent years. This is obviously especially important after the economic fallout from COVID-19. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, let's briefly discuss the rate setting process. So we can think of three main principles when setting rates. First is revenue stability. A public water agency's financial goal is not to make a profit, so their rates are just set to offset the cost of operation. Second is equitability. Costs need to be allocated proportionally across customers, especially to be compliant with Prop 218. And finally is affordability. Water is essential to life and has been categorized as a human right by the state of California. Next slide, please. So we can kind of think of rate setting as a balancing act between these three principles. It's typically easier to accomplish revenue stability and equitability than it is to accomplish affordability. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of different ways to calculate affordability. Obviously, we won't go into all of them today. We've been focusing more on bill impacts analysis, where we're comparing bills under current and proposed rates. We've had this focus because of the constraints of revenue stability and equitability. We want to minimize the impacts as much as possible while still ensuring that we have revenue stability and equitability. Next slide, please. So we've had a couple concerns with the kind of more traditional approaches. So typically these analyses are conducted after the rates have already been set. And also there's a focus on hypothetical customers, which ignores customer distribution. If you've ever read a rate study, you're probably familiar with a plot like this, where we're plotting monthly bill against monthly usage for current and proposed rates. This obviously tells a much different story if customers are clustered at 10 HCF a month versus if they're clustered around 20 HCF per month. So we've kind of wanted to focus on that customer distribution a little bit more. Next slide, please. So with these thoughts in mind, we have built the bill impacts application that we utilize with our clients during the rate setting process that helps us address affordability throughout all stages of rate design. So we'll just kind of go through a little bit how we use this tool when we're setting rates with our clients. Next slide, please. All right, so first we have a plot of changes in monthly bill by usage level. The color of the dots there are corresponding to different customer classes, and the size of the bubbles correspond to how many customers are at that point. So this is based on historical usage data from the previous year. And so this allows us to visualize all the customers at once and get a kind of a broad view of how the proposed rates are expected to affect the existing customers. Next slide, please. And so building up from this customer level data allows us to break down our data into any group that we want to. We can break it down into customer class, meter size, geospatially. This allows us to kind of hone in on any group that the district wants us to focus on. So here, if we look at these effects across customer classes in this box plot, we tweak the rates until we can minimize the impacts across the different groups as much as possible. Next slide, please. So finally, we wanted a way to kind of objectively compare different rate structures. So we came up with what we're calling the water bill criterion. Essentially, we wanted a metric that penalizes larger rate adjustments relative to smaller rate adjustments and differentiates between increases and decreases. So we calculate this for each customer and then sum this across all the customers in the agency. And then we have kind of one metric for how big the impact of the new rate structure will be. This allows us to kind of optimize over this one metric and try to find the best rates, the rate structure that minimizes the impacts to customers. Next slide, please. So by incorporating this into our dashboard, we can save the results of our WBC value from all the rate structures that we try out. We can go back and tweak the rates and then have kind of real-time feedback with how these rate structures are expected to affect different customers. And then so we are attempting to minimize that WBC value and then select the rate structure that has the smallest impact on the existing customers. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for your time. All those little GIFs were just samples of the sample dashboard that we have hosted online. You all are welcome to take a look at it and email me if you have any questions. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Bjorn. So it's great to see all this great analytics, and it's always awesome to see kind of the updated kind of thinking about this from using our shiny dashboards. And I know from my team, we were big fans of that, just as being able to work in more kind of an open source and shared analytics framework. So very cool work. Our last speaker is Audrey Dickinson from Fitch, and she's going to talk a bit about why rating agencies care about affordability, and should provide a great context to take your last speakers. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Drew. Happy to be here today. As Drew mentioned, I'm in Austin, Texas, and grew up here. So if you hear y'all, that's why. That explains it. So I think each of the panelists before me has touched on this affordability concept. So if we can bring up the slide deck for this topic, and I'm going to take it now to the national level, because affordability issues are certainly something that utilities across the nation are facing. It's not just specific to our California utilities. So while we're on this slide, I want to bring up the polling question that was submitted. How much do you think the average water bill has increased in the last 5 to 10 years? I will not go through each of those decimal to decimal by the percentage points, but I'll give folks a minute to submit their responses. And while folks are submitting their responses, if we can go to the next slide. Once we close that out, we have a good response. And let's hold off on posting the results though quite yet. Great. So what I want to focus on this slide is we have these mounting affordability concerns. And why is that? Why is that happening now? So the focus of this slide is the table that's here. And this is presenting information from the US Census Bureau. And it's showing the average income for each income quintile from 2010 to 2018. And an quintile is basically taking a full income distribution and then breaking it into 20% increments. So what this table is showing us is that our lowest income earners in the lowest quintile saw their income grow by about 9% over this period. When we look at the highest quintile, their income grew by almost 20%. And then if we look at the very top 5%, we see that income grew by 25% over this time period. So now I'd like to put up the response to the polling question and see what folks thought as far as the answer there. Okay, well, some were close. The actual answer was C. From Fitch's portfolio of a sample of 219 credits across the country, the average water bill increased by 27.7% over this time period. So clearly nobody's income growth is keeping up with the rate of increase that we're seeing on water bills. And I don't think that's a surprise to folks after we've looked at these previous slides that are showing water rates increasing much higher than inflation, higher than other bills, and higher than other items within a basket of goods. So why else is affordability becoming more of a topic? I would argue that it's also because the EPA has brought this up in recent years. So the EPA has their standard affordability metric that is based on median household income. But within the last couple of years, they basically posed and suggested that they want to change their affordability metric. So a panel was formed and made some recommendations. And by opening this dialogue, I think it did bring it to the national level, at least within a utility industry policy wonk aspect. And lastly, while this is certainly not new, there's no federal support program for water bills like we see in the energy sector. So people can get payment assistance through the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program that's administered through the US Department of Health and Human Services, but there's nothing like that for a water bill. And so it's really fallen on mostly local, sometimes state policymakers to address this affordability concern and also the assistance aspect. So let's move to the next slide. We see this is what's driving these mounting affordability concerns, increasing rates, income that's not keeping pace, and not a federal assistance program. And now we have coronavirus that gets layered in on top of it. And I'd say the implications are twofold here. So the first is within the utilities that serve a primarily residential base, as we've talked about, when we've talked to utilities, the increased demand that was seen at the residential level largely offset, or in some cases more than offset, decreased demand of industrial customers. And again, this is for utilities that serve primarily residential properties anyway. So we see that happening. And also, as we've seen in our previous panel discussions, there's been a shift to the tiered rate structure and the inclining block rates. So obviously with this higher usage came higher bills. And this created an immediate affordability crunch for some. Well, on the other hand, we had utility managers and local policy leaders recognizing this and wanting to mitigate the effects of higher bills. So obviously, and this is across the country again, disconnects have been suspended, obvious public health reasons there. Delinquent charges have also largely been suspended. Rates were frozen. In some cases, rates were even rolled back. I'm here in Austin, and both the water and the power utilities decreased their rates back in May. So we've seen a lot of utilities pausing on any type of planned rate increase. Well, what's interesting here though is the higher residential demand is likely to be a temporary occurrence. Once things normalize within the public health situation and people do return to an office setting, we'll likely see this residential demand go back to where we saw it previously. But the pause on rate adjustments was just that. It's a pause. The utilities we've spoken to who decided to not implement a previously planned rate increase still plan on implementing it either later this year, maybe in January, but certainly by their next fiscal year. So really all this has done is been a brief moment of respite, really. The affordability issue is certainly not going away. Lastly, and this was touched on too, is the concept of water as a human right. And it's normally in a crisis mode that this comes to the forefront again. And at a national level, probably the last time this became a topic of discussion so much was after the Flint, Michigan water crisis. So we'll move to the last slide and talk about the future of affordability and how do we determine what's affordable. And unfortunately, I do not have the magic solution to that, but I will say, and the main focus here is that it's not going to be just about the median household income as this affordability metric. The amount of data that's publicly available is growing rapidly, if not exponentially. And so that's really what's going to let utilities decide how to craft an affordability metric, is all of the data that's becoming available. So with this data, it will also let utilities customize what works for their system and for their customer base. One of the greatest struggles we had at Fitch when developing our new affordability metric, which moved away from median household income and is now based on an income distribution, was that we had to devise something that could be applied across our entire portfolio of utilities. And the good news is that you at the local utility level are not hamstrung. You're not constrained by that. You can customize it to the needs of your customers and to the needs of your utility. I would also say that affordability will just continue to be a balance of needs. I think Maura touched on this earlier, is that yes, we have the needs of our customers and providing affordable and safe drinking water, but it's also the needs of utilities who absolutely have capital needs and regulatory requirements that they have to meet, along with their financial needs. So I'll wrap it up with one of the comments from a panel yesterday was talking about a water agency should be evolving, transforming, and using data to make factually based decisions that are collaborative. And this is the exact opportunity. Affordability is providing this nexus of data and dialogue with customers and really setting the stage, I think, for some unique approaches and also transformational approaches to how utilities are going to look at affordability. So I think now we're at the Q&A, if there's time for that, Drew.
So unfortunately, we're 3 minutes over on our session. I'm very sorry, my panelists. I would encourage everyone to reach out. I thank the panelists for responding to some of the questions live. But that was awesome closing that out, Audra. I thought that was a great way to put it. I think distributions matter and really need to think more about the distributional impacts as utilities and use all this data. And that's really a key lesson learned for utilities. And so with that, really want to thank this panel. You did an awesome job, and we obviously had more content, and obviously financial impacts of COVID are worth a follow-up discussion for sure. I know there's going to be a lot of good dissertations and follow-up research and analysis of the impacts of this for years to come. So hope to keep that conversation going, and we'll pass along any further questions to the panel and make sure to get that back to the audience. So thanks so much, and we'll be switching gears to our next panel.